This week, the Trump administration has suspended US military aid to Ukraine, including critical spare parts and intelligence sharing. Shortly after, Russian forces split Ukrainian troops in the Kursk region and are currently close to encircling them completely. On the political front, we discuss the consequences of Trump's decision on the Ukrainian war effort and the possibility of peace in the region. We also look towards Brussels as European leaders prepare to ramp up defense budgets and increase support for Ukraine to make up for Trump's decision. Can Europe and Ukraine take on Russia without the US? What is Trump's endgame? Let's find out. After Trump and Zelensky's rather public falling out, the consequences to Ukraine have been devastating. The US has suspended critical military assistance to Ukraine, including weapons, ammunition, and spare parts. This has weakened Ukraine's defense capabilities, particularly concerning US-made Abrams tanks and other advanced systems. But the reality is that Ukraine's challenges go beyond just weapons or ammunition. While Ukraine has amassed a significant number of drones, many of these are heavily reliant, if not entirely dependent, on Starlink for communication and operation. This reliance on American technology raises critical questions about Ukraine's ability to sustain its defense efforts without US backing. The most critical vulnerability for Ukraine is its reliance on Starlink for communication and drone operations. Without Starlink, Ukraine's ability to coordinate its military efforts would collapse, rendering much of its drone fleet useless and leaving its troops isolated on the front lines. If Starlink were cut off tomorrow, drone operations could plummet by 50 to 90%, and communication systems would collapse, forcing reliance on less secure networks like Kyivstar, which are vulnerable to Russian surveillance. Ukraine is already experiencing troubles after the US pulled intelligence sharing with Ukraine, leaving them with reduced access to crucial information for planning defense strategies against Russian forces. Taking advantage of this reduced support, Russia has intensified its military actions against Ukraine. In the past 2 days, Russian forces have conducted heavy aerial assaults, resulting in over 20 deaths. These strikes targeted various regions, including Donetsk and Kharkiv, leading to numerous casualties and widespread destruction. Additionally, Russia has retaken 3 villages and destroyed 31 Ukrainian drones. Ukrainian troops are currently facing the risk of encirclement in the Kursk region of Russia. Approximately 10,000 Ukrainian soldiers are at risk of being surrounded and trapped due to intensified Russian military actions and a significant reduction in US intelligence support. This situation has left Ukrainian forces vulnerable, with Russian and North Korean troops, supported by advanced drones, making significant advances in the southeast and threatening Ukrainian supply lines. In response to these developments, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky has called for additional sanctions against Russia. He emphasized the need for increased international pressure following devastating missile attacks that resulted in numerous casualties, including civilians and children. These attacks have further strained Ukraine's defense capabilities, especially after the US decision to halt satellite imagery sharing, which has significantly impaired Ukraine's ability to detect and respond to threats effectively. For many Ukrainians, it feels like a betrayal by their American allies. Yet in the US, suspending military aid to Ukraine is seen not as a betrayal, but as a necessary step to prioritize American interests and resources. Why should hard-working American taxpayers foot the bill for Ukraine's defense, especially when the US faces pressing domestic challenges like border security, infrastructure, and economic recovery? The billions spent on weapons, ammunition, and advanced military systems like Abrams tanks could be better utilized at home, rather than being sent to a distant conflict that does not directly threaten US sovereignty. The reduction in intelligence sharing with Ukraine is another example of how the US should avoid entangling itself in foreign disputes. By stepping back, the US avoids being drawn deeper into a protracted conflict with Russia, a nuclear-armed state. The strained relations between the US and Ukraine, while unfortunate, are a natural consequence of this necessary recalibration of American foreign policy. Ukraine must learn to stand on its own, rather than relying on the US as a perpetual security guarantor. Although Zelensky thinks that the US will feel the impact of the war eventually, there is a whole ocean between the US and continental Europe, making that extremely unlikely. In fact, most of the fallout will be felt by the Europeans, leaving America unaffected. So this shift encourages European nations to take greater responsibility for their own backyard, rather than depending on American aid. We will touch on Europe's reaction to this in a minute. This fallout is bad news for the Ukrainian armed forces, but good news for peace. Russia has become more positive that a peace deal could be reached with Trump brokering it. Russian President Vladimir Putin has expressed readiness to engage in peace negotiations to resolve the ongoing conflict in Ukraine. Following a phone call with Trump, Putin indicated a willingness to commence talks aimed at ending the war. However, Zelensky refuses to compromise, stating that any agreement reached without Ukraine's involvement would be unacceptable. He emphasized that Ukraine must be an integral part of any discussions concerning its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Trump's push for Ukraine to negotiate with Russia, even if it requires concessions, reflects a pragmatic approach to ending the conflict. While critics argue that this undermines Ukraine's sovereignty, the reality is that endless war benefits no one. Russia, for its part, has proven to be far more self-sufficient than many anticipated, especially compared to Ukraine. The war has highlighted Russia's resilience, particularly in an attritional conflict. Russia's economy, though smaller in GDP compared to Western nations, is resilient due to its reliance on raw materials and energy exports. Ukraine, on the other hand, faces significant challenges, particularly in manpower. The country's most precious resource, its soldiers, is dwindling. As Trump bluntly puts it, it takes 18 years to make a Ukrainian soldier. If the war continues, Ukraine risks running out of men to fight, a grim reality that underscores the urgency of finding a resolution. A negotiated peace, even if imperfect, is preferable to a prolonged conflict that drains resources and risks escalation. The increased Russian aggression following the reduction of US support is a regrettable but predictable outcome. However, it underscores the need for Ukraine to seek a diplomatic resolution rather than relying on external military aid. The erosion of international support for Ukraine is a reminder that the world is not obligated to prop up every nation in conflict. American tax dollars should not be spent on foreign wars when there are pressing needs at home. The public discontent in Ukraine over diminished US aid is understandable, but it is not America's responsibility to solve every crisis abroad. The potential for increased Russian influence in the region is a regional issue that Europe must address, not the United States. The conversation then shifts to Europe's role in this conflict. Could European nations step up to fill the void left by the US? Some smaller Baltic countries, often referred to as little chihuahuas, might see this as an opportunity to demonstrate their strength by deploying forces to Ukraine. However, the question remains, does Europe have the capability to field such a force independently? Trump has sarcastically asked, "Could you take on Russia by yourselves?" The response from European leaders, like Keir Starmer, is strangely hesitant, reflecting the continent's reliance on American support. The conversation also touches on the role of European leaders, who have been vocal about supporting Ukraine but often fall short when it comes to concrete action. While leaders like Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer talk about sending troops or providing military aid, the fine print often reveals that such actions are contingent on American support. This reliance on the US has led to frustration among some observers, who question whether Europe has the will or capability to act independently. Recently, European nations began undertaking significant measures to bolster their defense capabilities and achieve greater strategic autonomy, starting with the Rearm Europe initiative. The Rearm Europe initiative is a bold strategy aimed at strengthening the European Union's military infrastructure. This ambitious plan seeks to mobilize up to €800 billion over the next 4 years, ensuring that Europe can enhance its defense capabilities and reduce reliance on external allies. A key component of the initiative is fiscal flexibility, which involves suspending EU budget rules to allow member states to increase defence spending. This measure could unlock as much as €650 billion, providing governments with the financial room needed to modernise and expand their military forces. Additionally, the plan includes defence loans, offering €150 billion in funding for joint defence projects. These investments will focus on critical areas such as air and missile defence systems, bolstering Europe's ability to protect itself against emerging threats and reducing their reliance on US technology. To maximise resources, the initiative also emphasises budget repurposing, redirecting existing EU funds toward defence-related investments. This ensures that current financial allocations are optimised to support military advancements without requiring excessive new spending. The European Investment Bank will also play a crucial role, as the initiative proposes lifting current lending restrictions that prevent the bank from financing defence projects. By allowing EIB support for defence firms, the EU aims to strengthen its military-industrial base and accelerate the production of essential military equipment. Finally, the Savings Union component seeks to mobilise private capital for defence, creating new investment mechanisms that encourage financial institutions and investors to contribute to Europe's security efforts. Taken together, these measures reflect a decisive shift in European defence policy, positioning the continent for greater military self-reliance in an increasingly uncertain geopolitical landscape. Individually, European nations are revising fiscal policies to accommodate substantial increases in defence budgets. Germany, for instance, is considering significant changes to state borrowing rules to fund defence and infrastructure projects, including a €500 billion infrastructure fund. These adjustments reflect a broader European effort to enhance military capabilities and reduce dependence on US support. The results of these efforts remain to be seen. Yet, even if these initiatives work as planned, Ukraine needs immediate assistance, which Europe might be unable to provide. Both the United States and European nations have been substantial contributors of aid to Ukraine since the onset of the conflict. Yet the type of aid provided differs. Although both the US and the EU provided around the same amount to Ukraine in total, the US provided more in military aid, while the EU's aid was more humanitarian. With the Trump administration deciding to pause military aid to Ukraine to encourage peace negotiations with Russia, Europe is unable to pick up the maintenance and repair of the US-supplied military equipment. However, the EU has one way of unlocking some temporary relief Ukraine desperately needs, and that is by unlocking €250 billion in frozen Russian assets to aid Ukraine. This is already discussed by some top EU officials, yet faces immense backlash and resistance from Moscow. Ukraine's biggest card in this conflict, according to some analysts, is the informational war. The country has successfully garnered widespread support from Western nations, leveraging media and public opinion to keep the world's attention on its struggle. However, this informational advantage may not be enough to offset the material and manpower challenges Ukraine faces on the ground. Ultimately, the conversation circles back to the human cost of the war. As Trump emphasizes, lives, 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 casualties, casualties, casualties. The toll on Ukraine's population, particularly its young men, is staggering. The war has become a battle of attrition, with both sides paying a heavy price. The hope is that peace talks, long overdue, will finally lead to a tangible resolution. Whether Trump's approach is seen as a betrayal or a pragmatic effort to save lives remains to be seen. But one thing is clear. The decisions made in the coming months will shape the future of Ukraine, Russia, and the broader geopolitical landscape. Enjoyed listening? Make sure to like and subscribe. See you next week.